evening to those of you who have survived and have stayed with us thus far. We're going to continue with this part of this conference that deals with the internal issues. We're really kind of focusing inwardly right now, talking about the Israeli public. And just like we heard from Tzipi Israeli in her research, so, like what we saw in the poll that was presented by Dr. Tzipi Israeli earlier, the Israeli public thinks that there's a certain weakening in the sense of solidarity. 70% believe that the sense of solidarity in Israeli society has weakened. And when we start exploring what is the main reason for this weakened solidarity, we find out the following factors. Hopefully, we'll manage to switch to the next slide. And this was also presented by Tzipi, and yet I'd like to once again go over it. 40% mentioned the tension between right and left as the main cause, and we can add to that another 11% that talk about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and that's also related to the left and right issues. So when we add them up together, we're talking about half the people who were polled who rank this as the number one cause. The next issue is the issue of religious secular relations, and if I add the gap between a liberal and a conservative worldview, we reach 1/3 who mentioned this as the second largest cause for this tension, and the other issues, the other gaps, you can see them behind. And another slide presented by Tzipi, and yet I'd like to repeat it. What is the most important value? We can see that the value of a Jewish state is defined as a key value, the most important one, and the comparison to the fact is also interesting. So what do Israelis really think? What is the reason for these tensions? Can we bridge over the different perspectives, and how? So in order to do that, we have convened a session with people with different worldviews who will represent different perspectives. Each of them, we're each individuals with complex views, and yet I will kind of label you or categorize you a bit, so I apologize. Let me introduce them. Dr. Lior Alperovich, who's a historian and a member of the Mandel Institute for Leadership, and also the head of the Center for the Study of Holocaust Visualization at Bezalel Academy of Arts. He's an ultra-Orthodox Jew, and he will talk about this from the perspective of the Haredi Jews. And next to him, we have attorney Talia Sasson, the chair of the Public Committee of the New Israel Fund. In the past, she was in the state prosecution as the head of the Department for Special Roles, and she wrote the report on the outposts, if you remember, excuse me, for the categorization here, but she will represent or provide the angle of the liberal left. Once again, I apologize for labeling all of you. Next to her is Amitai Leibovich, a lieutenant colonel in reserves, who's the director general of the AJC in Israel, and she will try to give the angle of how things look from the perspective of diaspora Jewry, especially American Jewry. And last but not least, Dr. Assad Millar, who's the head of the Jewish Statesmanship Center in Jerusalem, who focuses on political thought and nationalism, and he's also the chairman of the Committee on Civic Studies in the Ministry of Education. He has written books about nationalism, and he is perhaps a representative here of religious Zionism. And now I would like to join all of you. So I defined for the 4 participants a very tight schedule, and let's see if we manage. This is the last panel, and we'll try to make it interesting and upbeat beat or rhythmic, and I hope we'll all be focused. I'd like to bring up several topics. I'd like to start out, I connected several issues together, so I'd like to start with the issue of the role of religion in Israel, what is required in order to maintain Israel's Jewish identity, and what is considered to be religious coercion. And let's add to that the issue of the place of liberal values here in Israel. How important is it to guarantee human rights, equality, gender equality, LGBT rights? You each get 4 minutes to present your perspective on this topic, and the first speaker is Asaf, please, and I'm gonna start timing you. 4 minutes starting as of now. Good evening. People have talked about solidarity in this conference and about solidarity in Israeli society and what it is based on and founded on. In this context, I think it would be a good idea to remember that ultimately societies are based on formative myths, on organizing myths, and the tremendous success that the state of Israel is currently experiencing, and everybody who's been in this conference and everybody who's following up on Israel's achievements in this special time that we're living in, special in this context, cannot ignore the fact that this success has to do with the formative and organizing myths of this huge endeavor of the return to Zion, which we are all a part of in this generation. In this context, when we talk about religion and liberalism, on the one hand, Herzl, in his opening speech in the first Zionist Congress, said that famous statement that Zionism is a return to Judaism before it is a return to the land of the Jews. And the significance in Herzl's view, I mean, it didn't have any halachic meaning. He wasn't a halachic person. He didn't consider himself to be an observant or religious Jew in the Orthodox sense of the word, but still the significance of this, that in that great dilemma of Jews in the modern era, what shall they do with the Jewish question as it was organized in the modern era? Herzl's question and Herzl's answer and Zionism's answer was that Jews need to live in a Jewish country and, express or manifest the fact that they are Jews within some kind of a sovereign framework. So therefore, it is clear that the state of Israel doesn't need to be a halachic country. On the other hand, it needs to be a country that corresponds with the desire of Jews to realize their Judaism within that country. And in this respect, since we don't have much time, I'm not going to get into all the differences and the different arrangements that exist in Israel. But one thing is clear, that if we are in a situation in which there is a fierce struggle against any presence of the Sabbath in our public life, that means that we are in a problem. I'm not saying whose fault it is that we have this problem, because Orthodox Judaism also bears the burden of being responsible for this situation. And this also has to do with the flip side of this picture, with everything that's related to liberalism. It's important that we remember that liberalism in its extreme manifestation, even if we go back to the end of the 18th century, to the French Revolution and Robespierre and the attempt to make enlightenment, the religion of enlightenment presence through terrorism. I'm not comparing, but we are facing an extreme form of liberalism in public discourse, and the most explicit manifestation of it is the event in which legally the court has become the vanguard of a social revolution in which it is trying to prevent a separation which is publicly funded in every public, a gender separation, even for those groups, for those communities who desire that. And that is an extreme problem that distances the right balance in which the values of liberalism, and basically these values are Jewish values, and just as they are general and universal values, they are also Jewish values. And these become something that doesn't bring true freedom to a society, but rather it becomes an oppressive measure, an oppressive element that takes away people's freedom. Wow, exactly 4 minutes. Well done. So we've just heard one opinion, and now Talia, how do you see these things? Where do you see the balance? Perhaps you can comment and say, why not allow for gender separation in public shows if this is what the public wants? Isn't this a secular coercion? Well, I won't start with this difficult question. I'll start with another difficult question. Hello, everyone. Good evening. Modern view, and now I'm answering your first question. According to the modern perception, there's a difference between religion and state, or as it is called, church and state. And according to this view, there should be separation between religion and state. The state determines various governmental issues, and religion is religion. And if we look at things, take a deeper look into things, we can see that between the concept of faith and religion and the word democracy, there's a certain contradiction. We don't have time to get into it, but I'm just talking in bullets here. The word Jewish is a concept that combines both religion and nationality, and in this respect, the state of Israel is different, in my view, from any other country in the world. In the nationality, which was highly emphasized by Zionism. Zionism really emphasized the national element of the concept of Jewish. It did not negate religion, but it emphasized nationality. And that includes all kinds of things that we're not certain how to classify them. Is it religion? Is it tradition? Is it culture? Is it Jewish holidays? It's the Hebrew language, our tradition, Jewish history. How do we distinguish between these? I mean, there is a link between these different things. Therefore, the state of Israel that was founded as a Jewish country, I believe it was established on a national ethnic basis, and the definition of Jewish, just as the definition of democratic, is always a problem. The Supreme Court addressed this question, what is the Jewish state that's written in the letter of the law, and it gave a very narrow interpretation. I won't get into all the considerations why. Initially it said that Jewish means a Jewish majority in Israel and the right that every Jew in the world has to enter the state of Israel, and it's the connection between the state of Israel and diaspora Jewry. That's the definition of Jewish. Later on, back in 2003, there was a panel of 11 judges that agreed to the definition that a Jewish state is a broader concept, and it also includes Jewish holidays and Hebrew language and tradition and Jewish history, etc. But the concept Jewish state, in my view, will not be determined by the Supreme Court, even if it writes 3 additional verdicts like that. It will rather be determined by whatever happens in reality in the state of Israel. But we must note that just as the distinction between religion and nationality presents some of the difficulty that exists between Jewish and democratic, and I think that without getting into the content right now and how ultimately the Jewish identity of the state of Israel will be determined, and by the way, the new nation-state law, which I believe that the only good thing that came out of it is that it defined the state of Israel, instead of being a Jewish state, it defined it as the nation-state of the Jewish people. A Jewish state may be a religious country, maybe we need to apply the halacha. You could ask that in a country that defines itself as a Jewish, but the nation state of the Jewish people, it's exactly that country that allows Jews to enter and become citizens. Doesn't necessarily mean that religious needs to be part of the country. Talia, you have just like a half a sentence, one sentence, just a bit more. I'll take away from his time what he left. No, he didn't leave any time. He was right on. I think that maintaining Jewish identity, whatever that may be, I think that will exist as long as we have a Jewish majority in the state of Israel. And I think that there's a dependency between the Jewish majority in Israel and the fact that it's democratic, because if it is considered, and this is what's happening, if it will be fully considered to be a non democratic country, it will lose the recognition of it as the nation state of the Jewish people. And I think that if not in and of itself, then perhaps out of these considerations, I think it would be best for us to maintain these two values together. Lior, good evening. I'd like to say that I am here in a situation that I'm supposed to represent a community that I belong to, but I'm also sitting here as a historian of the Jewish people in a modern era, and I cannot but see what a dramatic period that we're living in. And when I say a dramatic period, what I mean is that we are finishing a historic phase that lasted for approximately 2,000 years, let's call it the diaspora, and we are moving on to a period that's called sovereignty, i.e., the Jewish people is now building itself in a reality in which two parallel timelines are managing it. One timeline is that of a political concept that's called Zionism, that in this way or another started out in Europe about 150 years ago approximately, and the other axis is the Jewish one that actually formed the first one that I mentioned, and it spans over a period of 3,500 years. This Jewish people doesn't know how to conduct itself as a state, because all these years since the kingdom of the Hasmonaim sank, we don't know how to do it, and because of a traumatic event called the Holocaust, and which killed off the main Jewish community in Europe, we find ourselves as a community in a different place, in a new territory, and we are now required to deal with challenges that are unprecedented in the history of the Jewish people. In this place, the Haredi, the ultra-Orthodox community, is actually in some kind of post-trauma. How do we manage a state when it is very clear to us intuitively? And when I say intuitively, I mean that the mechanism that shapes us, or that shaped us throughout history, is the halachic one. When I say about someone that is Jewish, based on what? What are the parameters? What are the criteria? How did I decide that one person is a Jew and another person is not a Jew? And when we talk about a solid Jewish majority, I have to say that this concept is too vague. I cannot refer to it because it takes me to a problematic place, and that is the view, the concept of a Jewish race. It's like there's this physical entity of a Jew, and as a halachic Jew, I renounce that, because Judaism is a commitment to that mechanism of norms, of rules that's called the halacha. The state of Israel today is behaving in an anomalous way, because the entrance and exit mechanisms are twofold. On the one hand, you have the Ministry of Interior Affairs, and on the other hand, the halacha. And I think that we need to understand that the State of Israel is a special project. It's special even if we look at the history of other nations. We have a special history, and this is why we created a project which is different. And any attempt to apply to it norms that are relevant to countries in Europe or other countries, let's say in the third world or whatever, is doomed to fail. Why? Because our story, because when we talk about a Jewish nation, a nationality, how can we characterize it by its language, culture, traits, or habits? Well, it's a sentiment. And let me tell you something. The forefathers of Zionism, and mainly those who founded the State of Israel, they did not consider this question. When Ben Gurion met with the Chazon Ish, it was clear to the both of them that they are Jews. They didn't need to prove that. They didn't fight over that. For them, that was the point of departure. But we are no longer in that place. And now this question has been brought up. And once we try to maintain a separation between religion and state, and I'm not talking about the legal aspects here, I'm talking talking about the conscious aspects. And if we try to empty Judaism from 3,500 years of history, it loses its justification, its raison d'etre. And there's a book by Professor Yecheskel Koifman, who back in 63 pointed at this problem, because once we aspire to have a country that corresponds with different models that do not understand the complexity, we are doomed to either find ourselves in an ultra religious place, ultra orthodox, that means a country that is managed by the halacha, or a country which is ultra liberal, and for them the Jewish definition is merely an empty shell. Avital, if you could maybe comment on what we've just heard, and how does that reconcile, and also the definition of a Jew and who is a Jew, and the issue of values. How do these things look from the perspective of the diaspora Jews, especially American Jewry? Well, it's the last panel, but it's one of the most important topics. So I'd like to say kudos for addressing this issue. Good evening, everyone. American Jews, this is no secret, have managed to be very well integrated in the U.S. And I'd like to quote one of these sentences that, they grow up on. One of the sentences, it's by Thomas Jefferson, who says, so he's saying there's a wall of separation between church and state. So the issue of a religion is something between an individual and his or her God, and not between the person and the country. And that's the situation in the U.S. But what are we talking about? We're talking about the largest Jewish community outside the borders of the state of Israel. The numbers are indicate that there's approximately between 5.2 to 6 million Jews approximately living in the U.S. Who are these Jews? 15% of them are Orthodox, and only 15% are Orthodox. And sometimes this data is confusing, because sometimes one could think that it's the situation is different if we look at Brooklyn and some other places, but it's only 15%. 15% is a relatively low number. The rest of them, the additional 85%, come from various denominations, and I'm not certain that all the people sitting here in this panel would necessarily define them as Jews. And I also sometimes hear various comments that I find to be very vexing. Oh, he's Reformed, then he's probably not a real Jew. If he's a conservative Jew, well, okay, maybe he's like half a Jew, etc., etc. And there are some other denominations that are less popular, and people haven't in Israel haven't even heard about them. But 85% of American Jewry belong to these communities, to these denominations. And there is something very interesting that I'd like to share with you, and it has to do with the question that we're addressing here. 6 months ago, we held a survey among Jews in France and Jews in the U.S., and we asked them the following question: is Judaism for you a cultural or religious matter? How do you view Judaism? And these are the results. 59% of American Jews view Judaism as something cultural. 24% consider it to be something religious. For them, it has religious significance, Judaism. And in France, you would think that the result would be the exact opposite, but lo and behold, 43% of French Jews consider their Judaism to be something cultural, and only 25% consider it to be religious. So see, here's reality and here's perceptions. And it's important for me to mention the subject of mixed marriages, which we cannot ignore. In the US, we're talking about 58%. In Europe, it's about 30%. So therefore, Jewish identity, especially in the US, is based on some kind of a community connection. Who are my friends? Which Jewish school do I send my child before his bar mitzvah? Am I a member of a Jewish organization? Do I send my children to Sunday school or to a Jewish summer camp? The guiding values maybe there is a certain overlap between them and the values in Israel, but there are many other values that we know and do not appear here. For example, tikkun olam, and this is something that kind of entered Israel only recently, and this is a very important value for most American young Jews in the U.S. Pluralism, accepting the other. These are values that at the core of the focus of American Jews, and here it's not always the most important in the core of our values. And one more thing, in the US, in order to be a Jew, you need to work. It's not like here that we all stand, on the roads in the traffic jams and the Pesach Eve and the Seder Eve and Friday afternoon. You can feel Shabbat. Here they really need to make an effort. And the state of Israel, it needs to decide, are we going to adopt and embrace all the Jewish denominations in the US, or is it more convenient for us to say, oh, the rabbinate doesn't think that they're kosher, so let's forgo them. And I believe that that should not happen. Okay, thank you. So we see here different opinions regarding the role of Judaism as religion, as culture, or the Jewish values. And I'd like to further emphasize the aspect of the liberal democratic values. It's not exactly the same thing, but the democratic issue. And I'd like to introduce something else into this equation, the issue of treatment of minorities. Yet another aspect of the fact that this is a Jewish country, and it means that anyone who's a non-Jew, there's constantly a question mark regarding that person. I mean, how that person is treated and this position. And it also came up in the basic law of the nation state. And how do we combine these things? How should we, in your view, treat the non-Jewish minorities in general, and specifically talking about the Arab minority? And this topic was brought up in previous panels. And if we're talking about values, democratic and liberal values, how do we reconcile these values? And here we did talk a bit about the Jewish aspect, and maybe we can elaborate on that. But what about the Palestinian aspect? Can we continue to control, to rule over a Palestinian population over time without that undermining democracy and democratic values? Now, Talia, you'll go first. How do these things all connect?
Well, you're probably not going to be surprised by my answer, that I believe that continued control of the West Bank of another nation is something that's detrimental to Israel and harmful to Israel in every aspect or field or dimension. It undermines significantly Israel's democracy. It undermines the Jewish majority in the state of Israel. It causes a feeling that every Israeli born here in the state of Israel, I mean, it's a question of equality. Who are you? What are you worth? And who's equal to you? That's an ethnic question, a national ethnic question. If you're a Jew, that you're worth a lot, and if you're an Arab, you're worth almost nothing, right? And when we look at Arabs in the West Bank, then I think the situation is something that undermines the very core values of the state of Israel as a democracy. And we have declared ourselves a democracy from day one in the Declaration of Independence. And don't tell me that the word democracy doesn't appear in our Charter of Independence. You're right, the word doesn't appear, but the values are those of democracy. So it's not a semantic issue. And I'm not addressing at the moment more acute issues that apparently everything I thought of peace is fantastical, and any American president can come up with some kind of plan and say that's what's going to happen in the Middle East. Okay, look, reality speaks its own language, and it will educate us and tutor us if necessary. As for the Arab citizenry of Israel, okay, a state cannot see itself as a democratic state without giving equal opportunity, equal rights to all of its citizens. It doesn't matter what ethnicity and what nationality. Now, it's true that our country, I admit this, I say this clearly, our democracy is not perfect. we give Jews from around the world to come to Israel and become automatic citizens. We are prejudiced for any towards any Israeli Jew around the world, and we are allowing to them become Israeli citizens immediately. That's one prejudice. I understand that. But the moment that someone has gone through the threshold criteria into Israel, once you're in Israel, we should all be equal. And if 20% of us are excluded and demeaned and humiliated and not part of our economy and not part of our politics, that is not only harmful to the Arabs of Israel, it's harmful to all of Israel. And the people that feel this way may, uh, people who feel humiliated and excluded may hate Israel, or even worse than that. So, for us, the Jewish majority, and for citizens of Israel who believe in democracy, have a first priority to incorporate the Arab citizenry within our society, within our economy, within everything, and give them all due respect and give them equal opportunities and equal rights. We turn to you now. I'd like to take one sentence that Talia stated, that she said reality has its own language. If I would extend what I said earlier, I think that we are dealing with values and their implementation in reality, and therefore we shouldn't be trying to grasp theory of societal development, but rather look at the reality that does indeed have a language of its own. And I completely agree that a basic, fundamental principle of ours, and I go back to the days of Herzl. He wrote it in Alt Neuland. He said it in a very sort of, that my feeling that I want the Jewish people to live well, and therefore the minorities among us must live well. That would be our form of reaction to the persecution that we have suffered throughout generations. Okay, well, if that's the situation, and if we go back to reality having a language of its own, we have to recall two things. One, very thankfully, very happily, we and went that there were. I mean, we are not today not under military regime like we had during the time of Mapai, and even the big gaps, the societal gaps, are being narrowed. And this is something that we see not only because of the last government decision with the 5-year plan and the 15 billion shekels to the Arab sector, but we see it in polls of satisfaction and pride among the Arab minority of Israel that feel proud to be Israelis. That's a great, great thing. But in the short time I have, I'm not going to ignore matters of the day to day. There is something within this deal of the century plan that breaks the paradigm. I mean, people usually naturally sort of organize right, left, we were right, you were wrong, we were wrong, we were right, or whatever. But here, there's something that changes that dynamic. And it's a paradigm shift, because there is a very sort of Jewish and purely Jewish and Zionist notation is that notation that the Jews are no longer some portable or temporary people on a piece of land, and that there are communities of Jews in Judea and Samaria at the very heart of historical Israel that are living and existing and working and functioning and living their lives, every community according to its credo, and they have the option to be forcefully ejected from their home, and that is something that a Jewish state cannot allow. And thankfully, that's what the Trump plan calls off completely. So those, creative solutions that we need to create and initiate in order to get to peace, they will be able to create a new sovereignty, a new plan, a new, I don't know, whatever. But the Jews of Israel, the possibility of them being uprooted from their home, that's something that's been removed, and that is a big and notable accomplishment. What happens if the Arabs in Judea and Samaria, what happens with them? I have 30 seconds to provide you with a state plan, okay? How will I do this? Okay. In this regard, one has to keep the historical context in mind. There is no Israeli Palestinian conflict. There's an Israeli Arab conflict that has been going on for a very long time, and within that conflict, the 74% of lands were taken away from the Jews during the British Mandate. This was something that was talked about in the division plan and discussed in the Zionist Congress. So this part that was left to the Jews, that is the part, meaning the western part of the western bank of the river Jordan, that's what's put up for debate. So there's a special sanctity in Israel that it's attributed and we've to the kingdom of Jordan as a kingdom of human rights and whatever. No, one has to keep in mind that Jordan and the Hashemite dynasty were tyrants who were tyrannical towards their own people. So there are also regional problems apart from ours. Okay, let me ask you, because in the plan, it's not absolutely clear how the Palestinians or what will be their status. This leaves us, there together without borders. It sounds very vague with the Jewish settlements. I mean, how do you address this point? We don't have a long time, but in your opinion, how do we sort of balance between needing to maintain our democratic character, rights of people, and the fact that you're connecting people who don't have the same status? Two basic possible directions. On the one, to say that the Palestinian state will be a tapestry, and so Jewish towns will stay in those territories under Israeli supervision, and that's what they said about the plan. If Israelis, if Jews want to leave the enclaves, they can go back. The other option is that gradually, as it happened in East Jerusalem, but gradually we get to one state, and if you know the democratic trends, the Jewish country won't go anywhere soon. Okay, so if we take into consideration what's happening in Jordan and not try to put every liberal theory into effect, but only talk about things on the ground and things in their regional context, then that would also give it an option to separate between the civilian problem and the national problem. Okay, I turn to you now, Avital. You talked about the Jew, who's a Jew, the various distinctions. But let's talk about this a bit more in depth. What I mean, what would do we need to have halachically? Apart from we talked about a few sort of civilian issues like marriage and so forth. But how should Israel address some same Reform Jews or converted Jews? How right would it be to turn that into to make it difficult for them to connect to Israel? And to what degree are there possibilities here? Because one of the things that's very difficult to crack when you look at the Haredi population is the question of flexibility. I mean, the Haredis are known to say, "Oh, that's halachic law, that's religious law, that's it." It's there's no talking about it. To what degree is that true, or is there a dynamic of flexibility within the ultra-Orthodox Haredi population? Wow, hard and complicated questions. And I don't know. I mean, if I had the answers to that, I'm not entirely sure I'd be sitting here. Haredi society sees itself. It's one of the images of Haredi society of presenting, the purity of Judaism, the pure version. And of course, that's maintaining traditions, and traditions are expressed in their clothes and the way people talk and how they run their families and so forth. A program of life called the halakha, the Jewish law. As for state considerations, at the moment the Haredis are not very interested in state considerations. I'm talking in great generalities, but the Haredis are a community that are struggling to understand what they're doing here. What do you mean what they're doing here? The sentiment is still in Warsaw and it's not in Tel Aviv. It's not on, and the Haredis are beginning now to try to understand that the Zionist project, that there was a high probability that it wouldn't hold water. It is holding water. It's still here. So what do the Haredis do now? How do you address Jews of the diaspora? Which Jew is worthy of his Jewish status to be part among us? Okay, these are questions. But for me as a person, as a grandson of Holocaust survivors, for me as a Jew, it's not, being a Jew is not a social club. It's an identity that my ancestors paid a very high price in order to maintain that status, to be Jews, to remain Jews, not to cede, not to ask for forgiveness. If you have to be thrown out of a country that you're in, that's fine. My original name from Germany, my father was born in Lithuania. Why do I have a German name? Because my father had to move on because they wouldn't allow me to allow him to be a Jew in Lithuania. If you need to move, you need to move to stay a Jew. So for 2,000 years we have maintained that identity through halakha, through religious law, in which people can join this tribe, so to speak. Wait. Let him finish and then we'll. Okay. That where life is organized according to Jewish principles. If you do it, that's you're a Jew. You can be reformed. You can be. The Lustiger, for example, was a cardinal in France. He's a converted Jew. He's a Jew. He began as a Christian, but he became a Jew. He converted. So these procedures don't care about politics or demographics. If we now determine that a Jew is not an Arab, the halakha doesn't care about that interest. The halakha, the Jewish law, the Jewish codex, sees itself as a systematic program. If you want to be part of this tribe of Judaism, you can do it. Not everybody accepts the halakha, I say sadly. I can't coerce them to. All I can do is maintain my hold on it, and if whoever wants to live their life, at the end of the day, you will probably cede their status as part of the Jewish people, because they'll go to a world in which they can't offer him anything but anti-Semitism, as you know in the V'Yichanan chapter. You are the few and there are the many, meaning demographics will never be part of the Jewish ideology. We don't care about the numbers. Okay, but if we look at the Jewry of the diaspora, I would ask Lior, and I would say that who appointed you? Why would the Haredis be the ones, or the central, or the central rabbinate of Israel be the ones to determine for Jews in the diaspora whether they're Jews or not? For them, they are Jews, 100%. Now, you talked about halakha, Jewish law. But also in regards to halakha, we all know that there are lots of interpretations for the halakha, because there are rabbis today that certainly accept and recognize a conversion of Jews. Do they have a different halakha than you? No. And there are those who accept, mixed marriages, and they still find from the same halakha a different interpretation. Now, obviously, I'm not coming to you as if you're, responsible for this. But as I said, only 50% of the world's Jewry is Orthodox. 85% of the world's Jewry do not consider themselves Orthodox Jews and don't meet your halachic standard. Now, there's a question of conversion, and there's a question of generational identity. But if you don't talk to these Jews today, you're going to lose them, and it's a vast number of people. So, in my view, these people must be part of my national security view here in Israel because of their strength, their power, their influence. And so I think that there's a real dilemma here. And in my opinion, it's unacceptable that there's one body that suddenly has appropriated Judaism and now decides whatever it feels like. Who's a Jew, is not a Jew. Okay, well, we can certainly... let me react, please, if I may. As I said, this advantageous view, talking about these Jews, okay, you know what, let's try to convert the Chinese people. I mean, there are a billion people more. I mean, they can all be Jews. They'll be able to build hospitals here in 2 weeks. Look, it'll be easier. We'll be light on them in terms of kashrut and other halachic laws. But what I believe is in a matter of principle in regards to who is of my people. And I turn who appointed me? Okay. Who appointed you to erase 3,500 years of tradition? Who, or Maimonides or Maimonides or any one of the sages, because they don't have any political acumen? Who gave you the authority to determine who is Jewish and who is not? Now, I put myself as a person of opinion, just like everybody here appointed themselves as people of opinion because they were asked to speak in a panel. I have an opinion just like everybody else. But who appointed me? I appointed me. And if I wouldn't appoint me, then nobody can appoint appoint me. Only I can appoint me, and only you can appoint you. So at the end of the day, these questions are not questions that the Jewish people are worried about. These are questions of democracy. If we had to count how many Jews we've lost over history, I think the number would be more than 6.5 million. We have 1 minute left, so I would say uh, maybe just please very briefly because we don't have a lot of time. Okay. Then I would just say that in my opinion, secularity, in my secular opinion, the Jewish people in all the diaspora, not you, not me, not anybody, will tell them who is a Jew and who's not a Jew, and who can and who can't, and who can do this and who can't do this. We're not going to determine their Judaism, okay? And I think the Jewish people established the state of Israel. We established the state of Israel. Nobody was at the gate checking your level of Judaism. And we, as part of the Jewish people, the state of Israel is part of the Jewish people. We're the vast majority of it. I don't think that we have the right to dismiss any Jew. Asaf, I hand over the mic to you. You have a sort of a brief time to give sort of a summary remark from your point of view. As for the last remarks that were said here, I'm just going to give you food for thought. The state of Israel is an amazing success historically, but one has to understand in the deep debate that we've had within the Jewish people in previous generations of it, is the state the true realization of our vision as a people, a sovereign people? Then Judaism around the world also see it as a great success story. So therefore, it would be a great thing, the right thing for us and Jews in the diaspora to learn each from the other their strengths and not constantly be in contention, I believe. Thank you very much, and I will summarize and say that we have all of the gaps and differences, but most important, in my opinion, that in order to resolve and reconcile these differences is to talk to each other in a matter-of-fact manner, where people, I believe the great threat is the divisive, a contradictory, adversarial narrative instead of people just sitting together and trying to talk together and find common ground. So thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you.